the yard where everything changed. Most prisons are built to contain danger. This prison became famous because danger seemed to escape the rules themselves. The gunshots echoed across the prison yard. For a moment, everything stopped. The shouting stopped. The movement stopped. Even the guards watching from the towers seemed frozen. Then came the alarms. Loud, sharp, endless. Inside California's Corcoran State Prison, alarms were nothing new. Fights happened. Lockdowns happened. Tension was part of daily life. But this was different. Because this time, everyone knew exactly what had happened. A prisoner had been shot. And it would not be the last. Years later, people across America would still ask the same question. How did one of California's most secure prisons become one of its most controversial? To understand the answer, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to a prison built during a time when California's prison system was growing faster than anyone expected. Back to a place surrounded by dry farmland and endless open skies. Back to Corcoran. From a distance, Corcoran State Prison looked almost ordinary. Tall fences stretched across the horizon. Guard towers stood watch above layers of razor wire. Concrete buildings sat behind security barriers designed to keep the outside world away. Nothing about it seemed unusual. But appearances can be misleading. When Corcoran opened in the late 1980s, California was facing a major challenge. The prison population was exploding. Facilities across the state were overcrowded. Officials needed new prisons quickly. Corcoran became part of that solution. It was designed to house some of California's most dangerous offenders. People involved in violent crimes. Gang leaders. Repeat offenders. Prisoners who had already caused problems elsewhere. The mission seemed simple. Maintain order. Protect staff. Prevent violence. But inside the walls, reality was far more complicated. Every morning began the same way. Steel doors opened. Counts were conducted. Inmates lined up for meals. Guards prepared for another long shift. The routine rarely changed. Yet beneath that routine, tension was always present. Many prisoners belonged to rival gangs. Some conflicts had started years earlier. Others had begun inside prison walls. A simple glance could start an argument. An argument could become a fight. And a fight could trigger a lockdown affecting thousands of inmates. Corcoran was designed to manage that tension. The prison relied heavily on security procedures. Movement was controlled. Activities were monitored. Every corner seemed to have someone watching. Still, maintaining order was never easy, especially in the exercise yards. The yards were among the few places where inmates could spend time outside their cells. For many prisoners, yard time was the highlight of the day. Fresh air, movement, a chance to see other people. But it was also where rival groups often crossed paths, and where conflicts could become visible. High above the yards stood armed correctional officers. Their job was clear: observe, protect lives, respond if violence threatened to spiral out of control. The towers represented authority, a reminder that prison staff were always watching. Most days passed without major incidents. But not every day. As years passed, reports of shootings during prison disturbances began attracting attention. Whenever fights erupted, officers in elevated positions sometimes fired warning shots or other authorized rounds intended to stop violence. Officials argued these actions were necessary to restore order and prevent greater harm. Supporters said officers faced difficult decisions in dangerous situations. Critics saw things differently. Questions began to emerge. Were all uses of force justified? Could some incidents have been prevented? Were inmates being placed in situations where violence became more likely? The debate grew louder, and Corcoran's name started appearing in newspapers across the country. Inside the prison, inmates followed the news closely. So did staff. Everyone understood that something unusual was happening. A prison normally hidden from public view was becoming a national story. But the most important questions still had no answers. The people investigating the prison wanted facts. Not rumors. Not assumptions. Facts. They began examining reports. records, testimony, incident logs. Every detail mattered. What they discovered would eventually trigger one of the most significant controversies in modern prison history. Yet before those findings emerged, life inside Corcoran continued. For correctional officers, every shift carried uncertainty. No one knew what the day might bring. An argument, a medical emergency, a lockdown, or nothing at all. Many officers believed they were doing difficult work under difficult circumstances. They faced constant pressure, constant risks, and constant scrutiny. For inmates, daily life felt equally uncertain. Most spent years inside the facility. Some spent decades. Many focused on surviving one day at a time, following rules, avoiding trouble, staying away from conflicts. But avoiding trouble wasn't always easy, especially in an environment where tensions could change without warning. One former inmate later described prison life as living under a storm cloud. The storm might never arrive, but you always knew it was there, waiting. As the years passed, outside investigators became increasingly interested in what was happening behind Corcoran's walls. Federal authorities started paying attention. Journalists started asking questions. Civil rights organizations started collecting information. The spotlight grew brighter, and prison officials found themselves defending decisions that had once received little public attention. Some argued the criticism was unfair. They believed people outside the prison did not understand the challenges staff faced every day. Others believed transparency was necessary, because when force is used inside a prison, accountability matters. The debate spread beyond California. It became part of a larger national conversation. How much force is acceptable in a correctional facility? How should prisons balance safety and human rights? What happens when maintaining order becomes controversial? No one seemed to agree, but everyone agreed on one thing. Corcoran was no longer just another prison. It had become a symbol of larger questions about power, responsibility, and justice. And those questions were about to become impossible to ignore, because investigators were getting closer to documents, closer to witnesses, closer to information that had remained hidden behind prison walls. Then came a discovery that would change everything. Investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that some incidents inside Corcoran might deserve much closer examination than anyone had previously imagined. Suddenly, the story was no longer about isolated events. It was about patterns. And if those patterns were real, the consequences could reach far beyond a single prison. As reporters prepared new stories and investigators reviewed new evidence, one question began echoing through California's correctional system. What exactly had been happening inside Corcoran State Prison? And why were so many people suddenly afraid of the answer? The investigations begin. The most dangerous moment for any institution is not when accusations appear. It is when investigators start finding evidence. The questions were no longer staying inside Corcoran. They were reaching courtrooms, government offices, newsrooms, and eventually, the federal government itself. For years, incidents at Corcoran State Prison had been recorded in reports and filed away. Each event seemed separate. A fight in the yard, a use of force review, a disciplinary investigation. On their own, they looked like isolated moments. But investigators were beginning to see something different. They were seeing patterns. And patterns are harder to explain away. By the early 1990s, Corcoran had become one of California's most talked about prisons. Not because of escapes, not because of riots, but because of what appeared to happen during certain confrontations inside the exercise yards. The allegations were serious. Some critics claimed that rival inmates were being placed together in ways that made violence more likely. Others questioned whether force was always being used appropriately when fights broke out. These accusations quickly attracted national attention. Whenever questions involve prisons, accountability, and public safety, scrutiny follows. Soon, outside investigators began looking deeper. Federal officials wanted answers. State officials wanted answers. The public wanted answers. Inside Corcoran, everyone could feel the pressure building. Correctional officers continued reporting for duty every day. Many felt frustrated by the growing criticism. They believed the public only saw headlines, not reality, not the dangers, not the difficult decisions officers sometimes faced. Every shift required constant awareness. A routine conversation could become an argument. An argument could become a fight. A fight could spread across an entire yard within seconds. Officers often had only moments to react. Supporters of prison staff argued that critics underestimated those challenges. But investigators weren't focused on opinions. They were focused on facts. And facts required evidence. Boxes of records were reviewed. Incident reports were analyzed. Video footage was examined. Witness statements were collected. The process moved slowly, very slowly, because every detail mattered. A single report could change an entire investigation. One witness could reveal information nobody had heard before. One inconsistency could raise new questions. And those questions kept multiplying. Meanwhile, journalists continued uncovering new information. Articles appeared in newspapers across the country. Television reports discussed Corcoran's growing controversy. People who had never heard of the prison suddenly knew its name. The public image of Corcoran was changing fast. For prison administrators, the situation became increasingly difficult. They faced pressure from multiple directions. They needed to maintain security, protect staff, protect inmates, respond to investigators, and defend the institution's reputation. Every decision was being watched. Every statement was being examined. The spotlight never seemed to fade. Then investigators made a discovery that intensified everything. They found evidence suggesting that certain incidents deserved closer review than originally believed. The focus shifted from individual events to possible systemic issues. That distinction was important. A single mistake can be explained. A pattern is much harder to explain. Suddenly, the investigation grew larger. Questions expanded beyond specific officers or specific incidents. Attention turned toward procedures, policies, training, supervision. How were decisions being made? Who approved those decisions? Were safeguards working as intended? The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the story became. Inside the prison, rumors spread quickly. Inmates talked about the investigations. Staff talked about the investigations. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, but very few people knew exactly what investigators were finding. Only fragments became public, and those fragments created even more uncertainty. As months passed, federal investigators continued gathering information. The case was becoming one of the most significant prison-related investigations in California history. No one could predict where it would end. For some inmates, the attention brought hope. They believed outside scrutiny might lead to reforms. Others remained skeptical. Prisons had faced criticism before. Not every investigation changed anything. Among correctional officers, emotions varied. Some welcomed transparency. Others worried that dangerous working conditions were being misunderstood by people who had never stepped inside a prison yard. The divide grew wider. Each side believed it was protecting something important: safety, justice, accountability, order. The challenge was finding balance among all of them. Then came the interviews. Investigators began speaking directly with people who had witnessed events firsthand. Current staff, former staff, current inmates, former inmates. Each interview added another piece to the puzzle. Some accounts supported official explanations. Others raised new concerns. The picture becoming visible was far more complicated than anyone expected. Nothing was simple. Nothing fit neatly into a single narrative. That complexity made the investigation even more important. Because public trust depends on confidence that institutions are functioning properly. And when confidence begins to weaken, transparency becomes essential. Throughout California, prison officials watched closely. What happened at Corcoran could influence policies far beyond one facility. The stakes were growing. Not just for Corcoran, for the entire correctional system. Then federal authorities took a step that sent shockwaves through the prison community. The investigation was no longer viewed as routine oversight. It had become something much larger, something serious enough to attract national attention. News organizations increased their coverage. Legal experts began debating the case publicly. Politicians started asking questions. The story had escaped the prison walls entirely. Now the entire country was watching. And with every new headline, pressure continued to build. For years, Corcoran had operated largely out of public view, like most prisons. Now every decision seemed to generate scrutiny. Every historical incident was being revisited. Every explanation was being challenged. The institution stood at a crossroads. Its future reputation would depend heavily on what investigators ultimately found. Then came another breakthrough. A breakthrough that would move the controversy from allegations to potential consequences. Investigators uncovered information that suggested accountability might reach higher levels than many expected. The implications were enormous. If confirmed, the findings could affect careers, policies, leadership decisions, possibly even the future direction of California's prison system. Inside Corcoran, uncertainty spread. Outside Corcoran, anticipation grew. Everyone knew the investigation was approaching a critical stage. The evidence was piling up. The questions were becoming sharper. And soon, someone would have to answer them. But the most dramatic developments were still ahead. Because investigators were about to reveal findings that would force California and the nation to confront one uncomfortable question. What happens when the people responsible for enforcing the rules become the focus of the investigation themselves? The investigation had begun with questions. It would end by changing how America looked at one of its most controversial prisons. By the mid-1990s, Corcoran State Prison was no longer just a correctional facility hidden behind walls and razor wire. It had become a national story. The investigations had expanded. Journalists continued publishing reports. Federal authorities continued gathering evidence. Public attention continued growing. And now, people wanted answers. Not assumptions. Not rumors. Answers. For years, the prison had operated far from public view. Most Americans knew very little about daily life inside maximum security facilities. That changed when Corcoran entered the spotlight. Suddenly, discussions about prison oversight, use of force, inmate safety, and staff accountability were appearing everywhere. Television networks covered the story. Newspapers analyzed developments. Legal experts debated the findings. What happened inside Corcoran was no longer viewed as a local issue. It had become a national conversation. Inside the prison, life continued. Cells still opened every morning. Meals were still delivered. Counts were still conducted. The routines remained. But the atmosphere had changed. Everyone knew investigators were watching. Every report mattered. Every incident mattered. Every decision mattered. For correctional officers, the pressure was enormous. Many believed they were being judged based on headlines rather than realities. They argued that prisons were dangerous environments. Split-second decisions were sometimes necessary. Maintaining order was never simple. Supporters pointed out that officers faced risks most people would never experience. Violence could erupt with little warning. Tensions between rival groups could become unpredictable. Security challenges were constant. Yet critics argued that difficult conditions did not eliminate the need for accountability. If mistakes had occurred, they needed to be addressed. If policies had failed, they needed to be examined. If oversight was insufficient, it needed improvement. Both sides believed they were defending something important, and that made the debate even more intense. As investigators continued their work, reforms began emerging. Policies were reviewed. Procedures were re-evaluated. Training standards received increased attention. Supervision practices were examined. The goal was not simply to investigate the past. It was also to prevent future controversies. Across California, prison administrators watched closely. Many realized the lessons from Corcoran extended far beyond a single facility. The questions raised by the investigation applied everywhere. How should force be regulated? How should accountability be maintained? How can institutions balance security and transparency? These questions had no easy answers, but they could no longer be ignored. Then came one of the most important developments. Federal investigations produced findings that led to significant scrutiny of prison operations. Although not every allegation resulted in criminal convictions, the investigations exposed serious concerns about practices, oversight, and institutional culture. The findings fueled years of debate. For some observers, the investigations demonstrated the importance of independent oversight. For others, they highlighted the challenges of managing high-security prisons under extreme conditions. Either way, Corcoran's reputation had changed forever. The prison became a case study. Researchers examined it. Journalists wrote about it. Legal scholars discussed it. Correctional professionals studied it. The name Corcoran became associated with broader questions about prison management in America. Years passed. The headlines became less frequent. The investigations gradually concluded. Public attention shifted elsewhere. But the impact remained. Because institutions remember. Policies remember. Systems remember. The lessons learned during one era often shape the next. Former inmates carried their own memories. Many remembered long periods of confinement, the tension of daily life, the uncertainty that existed behind prison walls. For some, Corcoran represented survival. For others, it represented controversy. For many, it represented both. Former correctional officers carried memories as well. Long shifts, difficult decisions, moments of danger, moments of stress. The experience of working inside one of the country's most scrutinized prisons. Years later, many still reflected on that period, not because it was easy to forget, but because it was impossible to forget. The controversy also changed how the public viewed prisons. For decades, many Americans rarely thought about correctional facilities. Prisons existed in the background, out of sight, out of mind. Corcoran challenged that distance. The investigations forced people to look closer, to ask questions, to think about what happens behind walls that most citizens never see. That visibility mattered, because transparency often begins with public awareness, and public awareness often begins with uncomfortable questions. As time moved forward, prison systems across the country continued evolving. New policies emerged. Oversight mechanisms expanded. Technology improved. Training programs changed. Not all of those changes came from Corcoran alone, but Corcoran became part of the conversation that influenced them. Its story became a warning, a lesson, a reminder. The most controversial institutions are rarely created overnight. They develop through countless decisions, large and small. And when questions finally emerge, the answers are often more complicated than anyone expects. Today, Corcoran State Prison still exists. Its walls still stand. Its towers still overlook the yards. Its gates still open and close. New inmates arrive. Others leave. The routines continue. Yet the prison's history remains impossible to separate from its identity. The controversies of the past still shape how many people view the facility. The investigations remain part of its story. And the lessons remain relevant. Because the central question never truly disappeared. How should a society balance security with accountability? How should power be supervised? How should institutions respond when public trust is challenged? Those questions extend far beyond one prison. They apply to every system built on authority and responsibility. Perhaps that is why the story of Corcoran continues to attract attention decades later. Not because it offers simple answers, but because it forces difficult conversations. In the end, Corcoran's legacy is not defined solely by its walls, its inmates, or its controversies. Its legacy is defined by what it revealed, that even the most secure institutions require oversight, that transparency matters, that accountability matters, and that the public has a role in asking questions when power operates behind closed doors. The prison became famous because of controversy. But the larger story was never just about Corcoran. It was about what happens when a hidden world is suddenly brought into the light. And once that light appears, it becomes very difficult to look away.